Ooh. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Wayward, called Waiting for the World. Okay, this was a project I found by pure chance from, the official Bandcamp Twitter account of all places. I just saw one tweet marking it as new and notable, and the description seemed mildly interesting and like something that could be up my alley, supposedly some kind of mix of ambient and downtempo music with drum and bass and breakbeat and that kind of stuff. So I initially added it to the lineup of the next Some Stuff I Missed video, which I'm still in the middle of writing. But, there's been pretty much no buzz at all for this project. I've not seen anyone else in my general circles, ever talk about them or mention them or anything. And they don't seem like anything special if you were to just glance over their Bandcamp page. Though they do apparently have a few interesting connections. Apparently they once did a remix of Basement Jaxx's Never Say Never that got included on the official single. And I'm told they've worked with Skrillex to some unspecified capacity, though I have no idea what exactly. Also, they don't sound even the slightest bit like Skrillex or Basement Jaxx. They do seem pretty professional, and not like complete nobody obscure Bandcamp artists. They've had singles stretching back a few years since 2013, 2014 or so, and a couple of them have 1 million plays on Spotify. And yet I also have more Twitter followers than them. Your guess is as good as mine how that works. But, I figured I ought to give them a chance. Check out this debut full-length album here. I haven't actually listened to any of their old stuff or their random singles or EPs. I just jumped into this with no real expectations. And you might be able to guess what I might have thought just from the fact that I turned this into a proper video instead of a Some Stuff I Missed segment. This project completely caught me off guard. It was legit great. At the end of my first listen, I was like, okay, this might be pretty solidly in the 8 range. But by the end of my third listen, I was starting to think, okay, this might be my favorite album of 2021 so far. I mean, not there's been a lot of strong competition this year so far, or that I can't see it being topped in the coming months. It's still only May 1st. But still, this totally threw me for a loop on how much I ended up enjoying it. And you wouldn't expect that kind of thing to happen if you were to just, quickly preview through it. It might not stick out to you as anything special. I myself went into it half expecting to write it off as some, mildly interesting little thing from a band that disappears from your mind a month later, like Wevel or something. It's not really getting points for originality. From a sound design perspective, there's nothing here I haven't heard before plenty of times. I guess some of the synth chords give me, basic channel dub techno vibes. The breakbeats are all the same breakbeats that everyone's already used a million times in the 90s. And they also directly credit Burial's Untrue as their biggest inspiration while making this. And even if the two projects are made up of fairly different sonic ingredients, you can tell that they were really trying to capture that same sort of moody vibe, albeit not nearly as bleak or depressing as that guy can often be. And they do use pitch-shifted vocal snippets in a fairly similar way to Burial as well. Technically, they have a mix of styles they can call their own, but only barely if that. They're not at the point where I'd be able to recognize their style from a distance. But even if sonically it's fairly derivative, what got this to click with me so immediately was just how freaking well they nailed this mood in such a subtle, low-key way. There's nothing about this project that's deliberately trying to impress you, but just something about the way they construct their melodies with all these jazzy chords, the way they pace their tracks, the way they mix and master all these sounds to really accentuate that lightly chilling but still strangely comfy atmosphere. Kind of thing that wants me to pull this out, go on a walk through downtown Chicago at night. It manages to both be freaking immaculately produced, but also feel like the kind of thing just some random British dudes who like Burial came up with for fun. It's totally unpretentious. It hit the same sort of note for me that a good Sounds from the Ground project can, where it's not so much the surface level textures that really keep me so well invested. It's more about the finer subtleties and the underlying craft. It is just all so freaking well done and resonated on such a strong personal level that I was legit not prepared for it all. And there isn't a single weak track on it. Right from the very beginning, you're hit with the title track, which, like, just perfectly encapsulates the mood and vibe the whole album goes for. Just starting very low-key with some very light, I guess, fake vinyl surface noise, being joined by these bubbly bass washes and synth chords slowly building up, being joined by skittering breakbeats, acid synth arpeggios, some pitched up vocal snippet in the background. It hits that right balance of both being really chill and laid back, but also kind of banging and feeling pretty easily danceable as well. Oh yeah, and there's like some kind of random phone message from some girl talking about a flight to Miami or something, for that extra touch of personality, I suppose. I was pretty sold on this thing right from the get-go, just from those bubbling chords and bass in the beginning that carry through most of it. Really struck me in their subtle but deep and almost aquatic charm. I love the way they sound and just had me like, ooh, this is nice. I just kept making that face throughout this album. Following track, All a Bit Mad, meanwhile, is just a pure banger. There's not much to it beyond its simple breakbeat loops, which I've heard many times in the past, going up against all these crowd cheering noises, and the voice of, like, this hype man with a pretty thick accent. Feels like I'm being transported directly into some underground club in the middle of London. Like I've walked into some no-name DJ's ongoing set. Nobody knows or cares who the DJ is, but I still get into, like, the energy of the people around me. And that's before all the chopped up synth chords come in later on to help give the track that more subtle charm to fit with the material on the rest of the album. Or these lighter, squeaky synth melodies that sound really familiar, like they were pulled out of some already established 90s techno outfit. Can't quite put my finger on it, but whatever, still an awesome track. Back to the Old Days is the closest we get to having a track that feels like filler material, but even here, it's not like this track feels unspecial in context or can't add something to the overall experience. I think this track was even the album's lead single before it had been properly announced. It's got like a collection of minimal icy pads that slowly build up over time, deep house synth plucks, and some plodding tech house beats going underneath it. And of course being most characterized by the samples of this mumbling British dude talking about thinking back to the old days, of course. If not for that mumbling sample, this track would probably just blend in the mix with everything else and not stick out too much, but it does manage to feel like a notable moment in its own right. Only a good sign when a track as good as that might be my least favorite here. Then we get a track like Canvey Island, which I mainly find notable for the way it progresses and goes through a bunch of different sounds over time. At first it's just a bunch of plucky dub techno chords, maybe being joined by a few low-key blippy melodies, but then it slowly gets overtaken by these airy, not quite choir-like pads that slowly envelop the mix and get more and more intense, being joined by much heavier banging beats, getting to this big dramatic climax moment about halfway through and then switching over into this other section that has all these female breathing noises and maybe like a few little vocal chops for good measure. And the breathing noises aren't creepy at all. They sound like they're going outside for a run at like 9:30 at night and getting some fresh air or something. They're unexpectedly refreshing. From there we get a two-parter track in Casper. Part 1, mainly just a slow build-up of these thick synth chords wavering in and out of reality, already pretty dramatic and atmospheric on their own, but Part 2 recontextualizes these sounds in a much more up-tempo context, stuttering those synth chords and filtering them to feel like the rhythmic backbone for another breakbeat-centric cut with some airy pitched-up vocal chops. And this track has some like beautifully melancholic chord progressions in its second half that are just so freaking nice. They totally envelop the mix and accentuate this feeling of wide open space, make me feel like if it were possible to look up at a starry sky in the middle of a city. The way like the two parts of this track work off each other is just so freaking cool. But speaking of tracks that make me feel like I'm in the middle of a city, we move on to 33, which might be my favorite cut in the bunch thanks to its much more overtly jazzier flares. Got some melancholy trumpets and pianos going over its mix of bouncy house beats and various little synth licks, and that one female vocal chop in the background that you barely even notice is there. They create this absolutely gorgeous, classy, soulful atmosphere that has me absolutely captivated the whole way through, and it's followed by a less than 2-minute ambient interlude called Jill, which you'd think would be an easy cop-out pick for least favorite, but even this track hit me nicely. Like, those ambient pads are beautiful, and that lonely sounding pitched up vocal sample in the back is a great touch as well. It's surprisingly one of the more emotionally resonant cuts on the album. Ridge Road is next. That's another big favorite on here. It does take a while to really get going. For the first leg, it mainly just sticks to its mix of breakbeat percussion and maybe a few 808s for good measure. Maybe letting a very low-key, high-pitched synth pad seep in, and then some light pianos. Then a little after the 1.5-minute mark, it feels like the mix just entirely shifts as this thin synth-pop sort of bass line is introduced. And even if not many new elements are introduced from there, the effect from there is just so enjoyably chilling, and another one of the most emotionally resonant moments on the album. And then finally we finish with Bright, which, okay, I'll admit we're not really going out with a bang here. It is one of the more muted and ambient-centric cuts on here, I guess. There's a good minute of meandering minimal pad progressions until this heavier, slower-paced beat sort of slips in with a snare that sounds like ice cracking sometimes. And being joined by all these nice little plinky keyboard lines, maybe a vocal chop or two, some more icy pads near the end, and finally finishing with this really melancholy and lonely little piano section. This was the track that gave me the strongest Burial vibes out of any track on this album, but I think it's only fitting that they finish a subtle album in a subtle way. And yeah, that's every track on this thing. I should mention, this album, it's nice and short. It's only 42 minutes in total, but it's just that right length where I'm not necessarily hungering for more, but I could easily just hit replay immediately after it's done. The track listing is nice and tight and doesn't leave any room for filler. Now, I don't anticipate that everyone is going to be as crazy for this album as I was. It being so low-key, subtle, reliant on tried-and-true genre formulas that might not stick out from the crowd. I don't think I'd really blink if someone were to call this project boring or forgettable, and I myself don't think it's going to be some kind of game-changing masterpiece or anything like that. I certainly don't find it to be entirely flawless, but still, I kind of felt like I was getting a similar feeling out of finding this that I think Ryan from Not Real Music did when he found Give Me Monaco last year. Just finding this undiscovered gem from seemingly out of nowhere with pretty much no buzz at all, and it just so happening to totally resonate with my tastes. Maybe it's not to as pronounced an extent as it was for Ryan. Wayward do have more of a history and backing than Give Me Monaco did, obviously. It's not like they came completely out of nowhere. Also, side note, if Ryan isn't into this project as well, I will be legit shocked. It feels like a mix of a bunch of different projects he's recommended to me over the past year. But still, I obviously loved this. It hit on a way more personal note than I ever expected. Like I said, it hit that sweet spot for me typically reserved just for artists like Sounds from the Ground. Very subtle and unpretentious and casual, not trying to be anything flashy or attention-grabbing, but just so happens to be so immaculately crafted and with its mood so well executed that it just totally pulled me in like nothing else has this year. It feels like it's recaptured that feeling I had when I would go on walks through downtown Chicago at night after my evening college classes around 2016 and 2017. Something that I haven't really felt in a long time thanks to, the pandemic and everything. And it just hit the spot so freaking well. And who knows how Wayward will end up going from here. If they manage to make such a well-crafted project feel so effortless, and this is technically only their debut album, I gotta say, I'm excited to see whatever they come up with next. Maybe if they get a bit more creative with their sound design while still retaining the skills they've showcased here, they could put something out that blows me away even more. All the same, Waiting for the World was an excellent little find and definitely a keeper long-term for 2021. I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10 on this thing. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, the link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.